My name is Will, and this is the 10th video in a series about the DC Comics character Martian Manhunter. This will primarily cover the character's appearances from 1984 to 1986. Specifically, it will cover John's return to being a member of the Justice League as part of Gerry Conway's Justice League Detroit. In many ways, this would be a pivotal time in the characterization, because it was a single author using the character for a long time, and these stories, unlike a lot of their Silver Age ancestors, focused on characterization, so a lot of John's personality and character come together over these few years. In 1984, a couple factors come together to lead to the retooling of the Justice League. First was sales. The Justice League sales numbers were on the decline. Meanwhile, X-Men and Teen Titans, two poorly performing comics that were revitalized by adding a fresh set of characters, were now doing great. So there was an interest in trying to replicate this with the Justice League by bringing in a younger, more diverse lineup. Another issue with Justice League was that it included many characters that had their own comic books, so they felt they had to coordinate with those books and that they couldn't really do much with the characters and have stories where they grew and changed. So the Justice League went through a kind of reboot to have a collection of characters that weren't in other books, skewed younger, and were more diverse. So Len Wein, Gerry Conway, and Chuck Patton created a new Justice League, usually referred to as Justice League Detroit. It combined a handful of old League members, a couple of characters from canceled comics from an event referred to as the DC Implosion, and some characters made specifically for this team. Gerry Conway liked the Martian Manhunter and had been a fan of his origin story, so he was brought back to be in this new league. Now, in the last video, I talked about how John returned to Earth to help defend it from a Martian invasion, and how afterwards he stays on Earth. The League was largely unable to do anything about the invasion due to Superman, Wonder Woman, Flash, and Green Lantern all being away. So Aquaman decides to disband the League in front of the UN and try and build a new League that takes the duties of the Leagues more seriously, basically full-timers instead of part-timers. So the Justice League comic turns to the creation of this new team. Elongated Man, Zatanna, and Aquaman all stick around and transition to this new team. Note that none of these characters were appearing in an individual book or feature at the time. John then immediately joins Aquaman's new League because he has nowhere else to go and he's looking for a home, and for him, the League is home. It's his found family and the place where he wants to be. Aquaman fired all the members who didn't have enough commitment to the League, but John is committed to it more than any other Leaguer because he no longer has a life or family outside of it. Perhaps because he didn't have his own comic book to develop them in. In addition to these four members, Gerry Conway also salvages some characters from the DC Implosion, Vixen and Steel. He also adds two completely new characters, Gypsy and Vibe. So there are a lot of characters and a lot of focus falls on these newer characters, Vixen, Steel, Vibe, and Gypsy. Each one is fleshed out in an individual story that is told in the Justice League comic. This means that John often plays a background role and is primarily a supporting character. He does eventually get his own side story, but not for quite some time. One of the key dynamics of all these new characters is that they piss off Aquaman. Aquaman seems to have this dream of what he wants the League to be, but what he gets is something very different, and he doesn't really like it. The members are mainly young and inexperienced. Aquaman has frequent conflicts with these new members, especially Vixen and Steel, and even goes so far as to control them with his telepathic powers. The new cast and the new character dynamics lead to two roles for John. One is that he acts as a foil for the younger members, both in experience and maturity. John is a founding member, and he comes across as an older expert. He's frequently used as a source of exposition, someone who will explain something, ostensibly to the other team members, but really to the reader. So John is often the one figuring things out, and this fits well with his history of being both a scientist and a detective. He can explain gravity weapons and time shifts. He can research the past, like when he figures out who Vixen really is, and he can figure out how to defeat foes like the Overmaster and Amazo. The way John speaks also makes him distinct from his teammates. His speech is stiff and formal, with lines like, "I trust this is a matter of some urgency," or, "Affirmative, we can only speculate. Not yet a man by human reckoning. Now, female, explain yourself," while his companions speak much more informally. This helps give him a sense of wisdom and maturity. The wisdom and maturity also comes through as John often gives counsel and acts as a mentor. Other members, like Vibe and Steel, can clash and get in fights, but John acts as a peacemaker and a cooler head. The calm wisdom is also part of his second main role, being a foil for Aquaman. Aquaman is very angry and hot-headed during this period. He essentially sacrifices his marriage to his role in the League, and when the world needs the League, the key members don't show up, and the League fails to stop a world-ending calamity. And this is why he disbands the League. But the new League is not what he wanted at all, and the situation leaves him unhappy, frustrated, and increasingly erratic. Aquaman pushes his teammates hard and demands obedience, causing a lot of conflict, especially with Vibe and Steel. John acts as the level-headed one who tries to calm Aquaman down and have him not be so hard on his teammates. And part of this is about the difference in how the two view the Justice League. Aquaman sees them as soldiers and a paramilitary force, and this is how he treats them. He makes a lot of demands and isn't interested in their problems. But to be fair, he ignores his own problems as well. When the new League members step out of line, he bullies them. But John sees the League very differently. He sees the Justice League as home, and the members are like his family. He's interested in them as people, cares about them, and tries to learn about them and their problems. John often acts as an advisor and confidant to Aquaman, and often points out when he is going too far. The differences between them, and John's role as a check on Aquaman, get highlighted when Aquaman begins to use his telepathic powers to keep his teammates in line. The first time, he uses his powers on Steel, and John's disturbance at this is very notably and called out even though he says nothing at the time. The next time Aquaman tries to use his powers on Vixen, John gets pissed. He manhandles Aquaman and puts him in his place, countermanding his orders. He basically steps in and takes leadership away from Aquaman for a brief moment. Now, there really isn't much fallout from this conflict. Neither Vixen, Aquaman, nor John seem particularly upset about the incident later. In fact, the next issue, Vixen is giving advice to Aquaman about his marriage. I think this is because DC editorial decided to remove Aquaman from the book, perhaps because he was slated to get his own comic. So story-wise, Aquaman decides to leave the Justice League in order to salvage his marriage, which really feels like the right decision for Aquaman. But his suddenly leaving does feel a little jarring since Conway seems to have been building up to this incident, and then it is immediately forgotten since the book shifts directions. Now in terms of direction, I want to take a moment and point out that Gerry Conway could have easily taken John in a different direction. At this point, John had been exiled to an alien planet by his people after his lover had betrayed him and tried to murder him. You can certainly imagine a writer focusing on a tortured and angry John, but instead John is used as a foil for many of the other members of the League, and he gets to be the calm and well-adjusted one. And he comes across as being pretty happy to be part of the League, even though he has been exiled from his people. So with Aquaman's departure, John becomes the de facto leader of the Justice League since he is the remaining founding member. Now, John doesn't want this job and doesn't do a very good job leading. He second-guesses himself as leader and makes bad decisions. His first mission is leading the team against Amazo. He splits the team and then abandons them to get more info. He assumes they will be able to avoid fighting Amazo, which is ridiculous because he himself is ambushed by Amazo and taken out almost instantly. And this was before he makes the decision to leave the team behind. He does gather crucial information by visiting the Fortress of Solitude, and he does basically figure out how to defeat Amazo. This kind of exemplifies his fighting style. John is cautious. He would prefer to retreat and figure out more about his enemy before fighting them. When the League battles the Overmaster, he forces the team to retreat in order to learn more about the Overmaster. When he fights Amazo, he tries to study him and figure out how he got free and what happened to him before confronting him. When the League fights Despero, once John learns a potential weakness, he hangs back, letting the rest of the League fight so he can take Vibe and strike Despero's weak spot. When the League is attacked by Infinity Inc., John is able to escape with his team, and then he goes and tries to gain an advantage by bringing in the JSA. Vibe even calls him on this, but in response, John sadly wonders if being more cautious about fighting might have prevented the civil war which destroyed his world. In all these cases, his approach is to not engage in order to gain some advantage, and this works out and leads to the defeat of some powerful foes. This strategic approach, lack of leadership ability, and not wanting to be leader kind of goes against the backstory started by Dennis O'Neil and finished by Gerry Conway, where a hot-headed John led his people for quite some time. I guess you could assume that John's negative experiences leading his people in a doomed civil war and then losing control to the Marshal soured him on leadership and made him cautious. It does seem like Conway wants to move away from the warrior leader of these stories and bring him back closer to his origin as a lonely alien lost on another planet. Anyway, shortly after John's first mission as leader, the League is kicked out of their Detroit base, and he feels like the League is falling apart under his leadership. When the original League shows up to help out, John approaches Batman about becoming leader. Batman is seemingly reluctant at first, but Gypsy begs him to take over, and he agrees, and the team is pretty happy about it. I guess they all agreed that John was a crappy leader. To be honest, the inclusion of Batman as leader was probably driven by sales. The sales of Justice League Detroit weren't great, and having Batman take over as leader seems like a reasonable way to try and sell more comics. They also shake the team up by moving them out of Detroit and to New York, and then eventually back into the League's original headquarters. Here is a nice callback to the old League headquarters. So after the League loses the Detroit base, Conway decides to make a John-focused plot starting in issue 246. The idea is that the League suddenly needs to get jobs and find a place to live. It's a great way to highlight how characters are different and how they handle this particular life challenge. Now, this idea was completely counter to what Aquaman had planned because he wanted a professional League devoted to the job and not a League of part-timers. But Aquaman was out of the League, and at this point John was just trying to keep the League together, because for John, the League is more like a family, and he was very concerned that the League was falling apart. But now John needs to get a job. He tries to resume his identity of John Jones, the police detective. One little detail that has changed is that in this story, John worked for the Metropolis PD. Note that originally John abandoned that identity because it seemed to die. But that is forgotten, and the police turn him down, not because he is dead, but because he's supposed to be past retirement age. Note that this is basically 30 years after John's first comic appearance. Now, timing and timelines in comics are usually pretty messed up, but this idea leads to some interesting results. One is that John has been around a long time, and the character had actually been around over 30 years at this point. But it implies that John had been active for decades, which leads to the "how old is Batman" problem. Now, Batman as a character has been around over 80 years, but his character isn't over 80 years old, so the time of his origin keeps getting pushed forward, so he can be an active man in the present. John doesn't have this limitation because he's a Martian, and Martian lifespan isn't really specified. And while his origin was written 16 years after Batman showed up, his origin doesn't move through time like Batman's does. So this introduces the idea that John had potentially been active before Batman and possibly many of the other heroes. This is an idea that I will revisit as it becomes a bigger deal in the comics. Anyway, John can't get his old job back, but he is hired to be a private investigator. Conway does this whole film noir detective thing with John getting framed for murder and then investigating the murder. The detective story does kind of hark back to his early days in the Silver Age as a cop fighting normal human criminals and mainly having to worry about fire. But at the same time, it does seem kind of trivial and doesn't really make much sense as a story. It seems trivial because it is mixed together with one of the bigger Justice League Detroit stories, the return of Despero. Despero has attained incredible reality warping powers and comes to Earth and trashes the League and turns Gotham into his personal hellscape. So the quaint little murder mystery seems pretty unimportant in comparison. This is actually a characteristic of this part of Conway's run, where the League shifts from fighting street gangs to fighting alien gods very rapidly. The murder mystery thing also seems kind of trivial because John is a super powerful alien put in the role of a film noir detective. Oh no! He's been framed for murder and cops rush in! He turns invisible and leaves. He needs information from a private investigator. He reads his mind. The story also doesn't really form a cohesive whole, and it quickly becomes more about Gypsy tagging along with John than anything else. When Conway's run ends, the plotline is not followed up on again, and John Jones, the human detective, remains framed, and the actual murderer gets away. The lasting part of the story is the beginning of John's relationship with Gypsy. The relationship with Gypsy was one of two deeper relationships that John formed during this period. The first is with Vixen. Immediately on meeting him, Vixen begins flirting with him, which clearly flusters him. And when Vixen's past catches up with her, John is the person who figures out who she is and what is going on with her. He also ends up protecting her from Aquaman. The flirting, though, is all one-sided, and it never goes anywhere, and it stops pretty quickly since Vixen turns her attention to another character. In fact, the flirting was more likely a competitive thing between Vixen and Zatanna. Another plot development that didn't go anywhere. John also befriends Gypsy, partially because he fits the wise mentor role. He is the one interested in her past, and when she decides to follow him when he is acting as a PI, she fills the pesky girl sidekick role in a way. Now, while the roots of these friendships start during Conway's time, they would both be developed more by other writers, and I will talk about them more in the future. In terms of friendships, I also wanted to just talk about his connection to the other founders, because this ends up being a recurring element. John seems to be close friends with the other founding members. He works with Aquaman as a trusted advisor. He approaches Batman and wants him to join the League. He enters the Fortress of Solitude, being able to lift the giant key and being recognized as friendly by the defenses, so he is clearly very trusted by Superman. There is an assumed level of connection and friendship from the past. Also returning from the past are some very old powers. Conway brings back both his telepathy and his eye-beams, which were powers he largely didn't have for most of the Silver Age and Bronze Age. They had about as much basis in his previous depictions as teleportation and control of magnetism did. But these aren't really the powers Conway focuses on. He more highlights John's shape-changing abilities, moving him away from being a green version of Superman. Part of this is how he fits into Justice League Detroit. Steel is strong and durable, powers that John has. Gypsy can turn invisible, a power that John has. Aquaman has telepathy, a power that John has. So to make John distinct, it makes sense to focus on abilities that are unique to him, notably his shape-changing. Conway has John change into a machine or door in order to surprise opponents, or into battle forms like a giant or a Martian monster. He also uses simple stretching. Conway also gives John's powers a name, Martian Adaptive Powers, which both sounds cool and is somewhat vague. But just because he focuses on the shape-shifting doesn't mean that John doesn't use his other powers, and Conway shows him using his regular strength, flight, invisibility, phasing, and enhanced senses, in addition to his new telepathy and eye-beams. One power that I'm not sure about is his ability to survive in space. He is shown as both surviving in space without a spacesuit and also wearing a spacesuit. Whether he needs one or not is never really called out in the text, so I'm going to assume the idea was that he could take a deep breath and survive in space for a short time. But that if he was going to be in space for a long time, he would wear a spacesuit. Okay, another way John changes beyond his powers and personality is his appearance. One thing that the second generation of X-Men and Teen Titans did is create noticeable size variations in character heights. In X-Men you have Colossus, who is quite tall, and Wolverine, who is quite short. And in Teen Titans you have Cyborg and Starfire, who are tall, and Beast Boy, who is short. So in this new incarnation of the League, they make John tall and Vibe is short. John towers over the other characters, and they frequently mention his size, calling him things like Big Green. This portrayal of size is not consistent going forward, but since John is a shape changer, you can easily say that he just changes his height in order to be at eye level or something. I personally like the size depiction as it conveys his strength and physical distinctness, but the size difference doesn't get as much character traction as other visual traits. One visual trait that does get traction is his collar. Now this started in Justice League of America 200, the anniversary issue that brought him back for a guest appearance. The art for John in this book was done by George Perez and Pat Broderick. Now I am not sure which of them decided to add the collar, but I am going to guess that George Perez wanted to increase the visual distinction between these characters since the book had a 15-member cast with 5 of them wearing capes. So John is given a folded collared cape that is open in the front, making him distinct from Red Tornado, who has the collar up, Zatanna, who has the clasp on her collared cape, Batman, whose cape is part of his cowl, and Superman, who has no collar. Now this wasn't a John-specific style and had shown up on other characters like Dr. Fate and Hourman, but this is where it started for John. George Tuska copies this when John appears next in Justice League of America 228, and going forward it becomes a part of the character's visual design. Beyond the cape, another superhero hallmark is the catchphrase, and his exclamations change during Conway's time. During the Martian invasion, John invokes the gods of Mars and Earth. Invoking religion before war seems very natural, but after this John takes up the exclamation and will frequently say, "Gods of Mars." This exclamation is very different than his Silver Age exclamations, which typically invoked planets. Those exclamations highlighted his origin as being an alien. The new ones hint at the culture of the Martians, and it brings up a question. If Mars has gods, who are they? This would be a question that authors after Conway would take up, specifically J.M. DeMatteis. DeMatteis would take over the book and close it out, and then carry John forward into the next iteration of the League. And he would carry forward many elements of Conway's John, but would definitely put his own stamp on the character. In my next video, I will talk about the Crisis on Infinite Earths, Legends, and DeMatteis's work on drawing the Detroit League to a close. Like, subscribe, and comment if you want to encourage me to keep making these videos.